Chapter 1. Here's the thing nobody tells you about dying with your eyes open. You don't get a warning before the next thing starts. There's no title card. There's no narrator clearing his throat to tell you the rules have changed. There's just a ceiling, unfamiliar and expensive, and a body around you that answers to muscle memory you didn't build. I lay there a long moment just breathing, because breathing felt like something I should confirm I could still do. The air smelled like cedar and cut flowers and money. The specific, unbranded smell of a room where nobody has ever once worried about a bill. My hands came up in front of my face on instinct, and they were wrong. Longer fingers, a signet ring on the right hand that I didn't remember putting there, and couldn't, now, seem to take off. I tried later more than once. It didn't move. Some things apparently came with the lease. I sat up too fast and the room tilted, and somewhere in that tilt I caught my reflection in a wall of glass across from the bed, and a stranger sat up with me. Dark hair, a jaw I hadn't grown, a face handsome in the specific way that used to open doors before it had ever done a day's work to deserve them. I panicked. Quietly, professionally, the way I'd learned to panic in my old line of work. No noise, no wasted motion. Just a very fast internal audit of every possible explanation, discarding each one as it failed to explain a dead man waking up in a stranger's face. Then my eyes caught a leather folio on the nightstand. Gold embossed letters I hadn't noticed until my whole body went cold. The Vance Ashford engagement. Formal announcement, press materials enclosed. 8 months of whatever this arrangement had actually been before today, and today, apparently, was the day somebody decided to make it official. Controlling interest. The title arrived in my head before I could stop it. Unbidden, the way a smell can drag you back into a room you thought you'd left for good. Dog-eared pages, a coffee ring on the cover, the exact paperback I'd been holding at a red light when my first life ended. Not a book on this nightstand, a book in my head, the last thing I'd read before I died, and now apparently the first thing I'd woken up inside. Vance. I turned that over once, twice, and felt the floor of my new life open up under me because I remembered that name. Not well. The book hadn't spent much ink on him, but well enough. Julian Vance, the fiancé. The obviously mercenary, mostly comic relief fiancé who existed in Controlling Interest for exactly as long as it took the real story to get interesting, and who disappeared from the page somewhere around the midpoint, quietly, the way a subplot gets swept off a desk. Here's the rest of what I remembered, for what it was worth, which at the time I genuinely didn't know. The book wasn't about him. It wasn't really even about the money underneath. It was about a woman named Elena Ashford, who ran a company she'd built her whole adult life around and trusted the wrong people with it anyway. One warm smile, one blood relation at a time, until there was nothing left of either the company or her that hadn't been picked apart by somebody she'd let get close enough to do it. I didn't remember how exactly. I didn't remember the order things fell in, or which scene did the damage, or a single line anyone said while they did it. What I remembered was the shape of an ending, the particular specific tragedy of a woman who lost everything because she kept choosing to believe the people closest to her, right up until the book ran out of pages, and so did she. I was Julian Vance. I was reading my own death sentence, printed and bound, sitting on a stranger's nightstand in a stranger's handwriting that happened to be mine now, and stacked right underneath it was a much bigger one. I now knew in broad, mostly useless strokes exactly how this woman's whole life was going to come apart, and not one detail sharp enough yet to actually stop it. That should have been the worst part of the morning. It wasn't even close. The door opened without a knock, which told me something about how this house worked before a single word got said, and a woman walked in, and every half-built plan in my head came apart at the studs. She hadn't bothered closing the robe all the way, and her hair was down loose around her shoulders in a way I understood, immediately and instinctively, was not something this house saw very often. Dark chestnut, unbound. The kind of detail that means nothing until you learn later exactly how rare it is. Whatever she'd slept in underneath was simple, plain in the specific way that costs more than a print. No jewelry yet, except one thing at her throat, small and old, A pendant I'd learn later mattered to her more than anything else in this apartment. She moved like a room had never once dared to be a problem for her. Spine straight, even half asleep, chin level, the unmistakable economy of someone who'd never had to wonder how much space she was allowed to take up. She had a coffee in each hand and the particular, unbothered ease of someone crossing her own bedroom. And, for one full second, before I remembered I was supposed to be a man who'd seen her exactly like this 1,000 mornings before, I forgot to breathe. Whatever she saw in my face in that second, I didn't have it under control yet. I want to be clear about that. It took her exactly one more look to clock that something about the man in the bed was sitting wrong. "You're staring," she said. Not a question. 2 words clipped, economical, the verbal equivalent of a closed door. I want to tell you, I said something smooth. I didn't have anything smooth loaded. What I had was every instinct from 31 years of reading rooms telling me all at once that this woman was the center of gravity in whatever was about to happen to me, and that I had exactly no idea yet what she meant to the man whose face I was wearing, or what he'd apparently meant to her. So I did the only thing that ever actually worked in my old life when I didn't know the play yet. I bought time. "Occupational hazard," I said. "You walked in looking like that. I'm allowed 30 seconds. I still didn't know in that exact moment whose apartment this was, whose bed, whose money had paid for the ceiling over my head. I'd have to piece the rest of it together over the following hour, like a man reading his own personnel file for the first time, which functionally I was. But I knew with sudden and complete certainty that whatever this place was, I lived here, with her. That much at least, the room had already told me. Something moved behind her eyes. Not warmth, more like recalibration, like a woman running a diagnostic on a machine that had just made an unexpected sound. She set one coffee down on my side of the bed without being asked, which told me this was a habit, not a kindness, and pulled the robe closed with one hand, like she'd only just remembered it was open. "You're in a mood," she said. "Fine. Car's at 9. Don't make me late in front of my father twice in 1 month." My father, I made a mental note of that, and of the coffee, and of the habit underneath it. The fact that some part of this routine ran deep enough that she hadn't questioned yet why the man drinking it felt like a different man entirely. She was almost to the door when I found my footing enough to ask the only question that actually mattered. "Say my name," I said. She turned back, one eyebrow up, unimpressed in a way I was already starting to enjoy more than I should have this early into a new life. "Julian," she said, like it cost her something small every time. "Are you drunk before 9 a.m., or is this a new bit?" "Neither," I said, and meant it more than she could possibly know. Just wanted to hear it out loud. She left without answering that, and I sat there in a dead man's borrowed bed, holding a coffee I hadn't earned. That engagement folio still sitting open on the nightstand like a verdict, and did the only thing that made any sense at all. I started planning like my life depended on it, because as far as I could tell, it did. I just wasn't sure yet whose. By the time I made it downstairs, I'd built the shape of it in my head from the wreckage of what I remembered. A woman named Elena Ashford, cold enough that the whole book kept its distance from her, engaged to a fiancé the plot didn't respect, sitting on top of a company the story eventually watched get taken apart by the people closest to her. I didn't remember the details. Details had never been the point of that book to me. I'd been reading it the way you read anything at a red light, skimming for the shape of the thing. But I remembered the shape, and the shape was this. Everyone around this woman was going to fail her, on schedule, right on cue, and the man whose skin I was currently wearing was going to get quietly written out somewhere in the middle of it for being exactly as useless as everyone already assumed he was. A woman in a dark uniform intercepted me in the hallway before I'd made it to the kitchen. 60-ish, hair scraped back, a look on her face like she'd caught me stealing from the household accounts on principle before I'd even opened my mouth. Mrs. Whitmore ran this apartment the way I used to run a room full of men twice my size, quietly and without ever needing to raise her voice to prove it. "Mr. Vance," she said, in a tone that made Mr. sound like an insult she'd chosen very deliberately. "Ms. Ashford's car is downstairs. I trust you can manage the elevator unassisted this morning. Depends, I said. Are you always this warm before 9? Or is it just for me? Something flickered at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, nowhere close, but the shadow of one, and was immediately suppressed. Just for you, she said, and walked off before I could push my luck any further. I stood there a moment in a hallway worth more than every apartment I'd ever lived in combined. Floor 40-something of a tower called the Marlowe, I'd learned later that morning. The kind of address that doesn't put its name on the awning because it doesn't need to, and let the whole absurd shape of it land. Dead man, wrong body, a fiancé who didn't know she was engaged to a stranger, a household that had already decided who I was before I got a vote, and a book in my memory that ended, for a man wearing this exact face, in exactly one way. Discarded, quietly, on schedule. I've negotiated with men who had a gun already drawn and still walked away thinking I'd done them a favor. I built a career out of exactly one skill, making people believe the ending they were sure of wasn't the only ending available. Fine, I thought, heading for the elevator. Dead man's coffee still warm in my hand. Let's see what this book does with a character who's read the last page and has absolutely no intention of playing it straight. Chapter 2. I spent the next 3 days doing what I would have done with any new job I hadn't asked for. I read the file, except the file was a life, and I had to build it out of scraps. A closet full of clothes that cost more than my old apartment's rent and told me nothing except that Julian Vance liked being looked at. A phone full of numbers I didn't recognize and 3 separate group chats where my name, his name, came up in a tone I'd have called disrespectful if it had been said to my face back when I had a face people didn't disrespect. One thread simply called me the deposit guy, which I decided reading it at 2 in the morning I did not want context for yet. A stack of unpaid invoices tucked in a drawer like a man hiding a drinking problem. And exactly one photograph, framed, of a woman who wasn't Elena, tucked in the back of a closet like evidence somebody hadn't quite gotten around to burning. I didn't know her name yet. I set that aside too, with everything else in this new life I didn't understand yet, but suspected I'd need eventually. It was strange work, auditing a stranger's failures like they were my own liability. And in every way that mattered now, they were. In my old life, I'd built a reputation on being the guy you called after the damage was already done. The one who could look at a mess and tell you exactly how much it would cost to make it disappear. I'd never once had to run that math on myself. Turned out I wasn't any gentler doing it. Julian Vance, by every scrap of evidence in that apartment, had spent 8 months proving he was exactly as disposable as the book expected him to be. I found that oddly motivating. Low bar, I'd cleared worse. Elena, for her part, treated me across those 3 days the way you treat a smoke detector that started chirping at 2 a.m. Aware of it, irritated by it, waiting for it to go back to being background noise. It came to a head on the 4th morning in the kitchen over coffee I'd started making myself instead of waiting for it to appear. "You're doing the thing again," she said, not looking up from her tablet. "Which thing?" "Being quiet in a way that isn't like you." She said it flat, an observation. The kind of line a woman drops when she's testing whether you'll flinch. Julian doesn't do quiet. Julian fills silence like it personally offended him. I leaned against the counter and considered, for the first time out loud, how much rope I actually had here. Maybe I got tired of the sound of my own voice. You've never been tired of the sound of your own voice in your life. People change. People like you don't. She finally looked up, and there was something sharp and assessing in it. An audit I recognized because I used to run the exact same one on everyone who sat down across from me. So which is it? New angle? New leverage you think you found? Or are you finally bored enough with my money to start pretending you have a personality worth keeping around? I could have laughed that off. Julian, whoever he'd actually been, probably would have deflected with charm, turned it into a joke, let her write him off as harmless and shallow, because harmless and shallow was easier for both of them. That was the version of this man the book barely bothered to notice. Discarded around the midpoint, quietly, on schedule. I didn't feel like being that man this morning. "Here's a theory," I said instead. and watched her go very still, the way people go still when they expect the next thing out of your mouth to be a lie and are bracing for the shape of it. You've had exactly one relationship in your adult life that didn't come with a due diligence report attached, and it wasn't with me. Everyone in your orbit is either selling you something or protecting something from you. So when a man who's supposed to be exactly like the rest of them stops performing on schedule, it doesn't read as growth. It reads as a new kind of threat. I took a sip of coffee I'd made myself for the first time in this life and let that sit. You're not wrong to be suspicious. You're just aiming it at the wrong version of the problem. The silence that followed wasn't the same silence as before. It had weight to it. She set the tablet down, carefully, deliberately, the kind of gesture that costs a controlled person more than it looks like, and studied me the way you study a door you weren't sure was locked. That's the most honest thing you said to me in 8 months, she said finally. I contain multitudes. You contain a body count of unpaid tailors and one truly impressive collection of empty promises. Don't get ahead of yourself. But there wasn't any real heat in it, and when she reached past me for the coffee pot, close enough that I caught the same expensive, unbranded scent from that first morning, neither of us moved to make the space smaller or bigger. We just let it sit there, half a foot of charged nothing, until she poured her cup and stepped back like she'd remembered a rule she usually didn't have to remind herself of. Don't get used to this, she said. This is not us being friends. Wouldn't dream of it, I said. Friends don't make each other coffee out of spite. That almost got a real reaction out of her. The corner of her mouth actually moved before she caught it and put it away. And she was halfway out of the kitchen when her phone rang, and she checked the screen, and every ounce of the last 5 minutes evaporated off her face like it had never happened. Ashford, she answered, all business, and walked toward the window with her back to me. But I've spent a career reading the 10% of a phone call you can hear from the wrong side of a room, and I caught enough. Confidence review, full board, not just executive committee, optics before substance. Always he wants proof, not promises. She hung up and stood there a second too long with her back still to me, shoulders set in a way I now recognized as the load-bearing kind. The posture of someone holding a building up by refusing to sit down. Everything all right? I asked and meant it, which surprised me more than it should have. Fine, she said in the voice of someone for whom that word had stopped meaning anything years ago. Then, like it cost her to hand over even this much, there's a clause, grandfather's trust, married by 30 or the shares redistribute. That's not a business clause. That's a hostage situation with better catering. Julian, one word flat, no patience in it at all. And I recognized the tone immediately because I'd used it myself on men who tried to make a negotiation funny before I'd finished stating the terms. Sorry, I said. Go on. 2 years left on the clock. Board wants proof before that. That's the whole mechanism. She said it like a woman reading out a diagnosis she'd already made peace with the ugly parts of. That's what you're actually here for, Julian. Not the ring, the clock. And there it was, the mechanism I'd half remembered from a book I died reading, laid out plain in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old money, except now it had a face attached to it, and the face wasn't a character on a page anymore. I've negotiated hostage situations with less on the line than what I just watched settle onto that woman's shoulders, like something she'd stopped noticing the weight of years ago. 2 years is a long runway, I said, careful. Plenty of time to figure out the landing. 2 years is exactly as long as it takes for a board full of my father's friends to find a reason to take my company away from me in the meantime, she said, and there was something under the flatness now, something that had teeth. So no, don't tell me it's a long runway. Tell me you can actually sell this in front of people who are looking for any excuse not to believe it. I looked at her, really looked, past the armor, past the clipped economy of every word she'd rationed out to me since I woke up in this life, and made a decision I didn't fully understand the size of yet. I can sell it, I said. I'm very good at selling things people don't believe. That's not actually reassuring. Wasn't trying to reassure you, trying to tell you the truth. I set my coffee down and closed the last step of distance between us, close enough that I watched her decide in real time whether to hold her ground or concede it, and something in me enjoyed watching her choose the first option far more than a man 3 days into a stranger's life had any business enjoying anything. Here's what I'm actually good at, Elena. Not selling, reading. And what I read, standing here right now, is a woman who spent 2 years bracing for a stranger to make her life smaller, and got handed one who's apparently allergic to behaving like the stranger she was expecting. Careful, she said, not stepping back. That almost sounded like a compliment. I contain multitudes. Try to keep up. You've said that twice this morning. It's a good line. I'm not retiring it just because it's working. That got the almost smile again, the one she kept catching herself having and putting away half a second too late. And for one unguarded moment, neither of us moved to close the last foot between us or widen it either. Both of us just standing in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old money, testing how much weight this particular kind of quiet could hold before one of us decided to name it. She named it first. Of course she did. Don't get comfortable, she said, stepping back, reaching for her tablet like a life raft. I still don't trust you. I know, I'm very patient. Ask anyone from my old job. I might. I hear the deposit guy has quite a network. That landed harder than anything else she'd said all morning, mostly because I hadn't told her that name existed. And I was fairly sure I hadn't said it out loud in this apartment even once. Where did you hear that? I read everything that gets forwarded to my assistant with your name in the subject line, Julian. Did you think I found out about the invoices from a psychic? She picked her tablet back up, entirely too pleased with herself. You should see your face right now. This is the most fun I've had before 9 a.m. in years. I'm not asking anyone from your old job then, I said, recovering, on the grounds that you apparently already have a file on this one. I don't actually know anyone from your old job, she said. I know a great deal about this one, though. It's a very short file, mostly invoices. Good, I said. Keep it that way, both files. She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders eased half an inch, and for a man who used to make his living reading rooms for a fraction of an inch of exactly that, it felt like winning something I hadn't known I was playing for. Right up until I remembered she just won a round I hadn't known we were playing. Interlude, Elena's diary. Elena was sitting in her study at the Marlowe, wearing a midnight black silk slip that seemed to drink the moonlight. It was fluid and weightless, shifting like water against her skin with every breath she took. It was a few minutes past midnight, thinking something about tonight that didn't match the Julian's file. She started to write in her diary. I read Julian Vance's file before he ever moved a box into my apartment. That was not negotiable, whatever my father thought he was arranging on his own. Nothing in this particular chapter of my life has ever been negotiable on my end. That's rather been the point of it. I am the only Ashford in 3 generations who has never once been blindsided by anyone she let this close. The family has used the same firm for background work since my grandfather's time. The kind of discretion you don't find under a name anyone would recognize, which is exactly why it's worth what it costs. Board nominees, new staff. Anyone Richard Ashford's daughter might conceivably marry, real or otherwise. I commissioned Julian Vance's file myself, 3 weeks before I agreed to have dinner with him, and I read every page of it twice before deciding he was the safest mistake available to me. He did not disappoint the paperwork. Minor family money, 3 generations thinner than it used to be. 2 years at a university he never finished paying for. A string of jobs that were really just introductions. The kind of work a handsome, well-mannered young man gets offered by people who mistake charm for competence and loses within the year once someone finally asks him to produce something. 4 landlords with outstanding claims. A tailor in the Flatiron District who'd finally stopped extending him credit, which apparently took some doing, given how long he'd let it run. Nothing criminal. Nothing that would frighten a mother. Just a long, consistent record of a man who had never once been asked to pay for something he couldn't talk his way out of paying for, until the bill came from someone with better lawyers than his. And Camille DeWitt, 2 years on and off, ending 8 months before the file crossed my desk, which meant doing the arithmetic automatically and without much interest at the time, that he'd been freshly, messily single for almost exactly as long as he'd need to be available for an arrangement like mine. The specifics were almost dull in how unoriginal they were. A deposit meant for an apartment Camille and her sister Rachel were setting up together. The kind of hopeful, ordinary expense two young women make when they have decided to be roommates instead of admitting the city is too expensive to survive alone. Julian needed the money more than he needed to be a person either of them could trust with it. He borrowed against the deposit. He always meant to put it back, the file noted, in the dry, unimpressed language of a document that had heard this excuse from 100 different men. He didn't put it back. He also didn't stay around long enough to watch what that did to two sisters trying to split a lease. I want to be precise about what I felt reading that part, because precision is the one thing I don't intend to give up even here. I felt nothing. Not sympathy for a woman I'd never met and had no plans to. Not disapproval of a man I hadn't decided yet whether I needed. Just the small, useful satisfaction of a hypothesis confirming itself. I had gone looking for a man thoroughly, provably incapable of wanting anything from me beyond the obvious. I had found one with a paper trail to prove it. That was the entire appeal if anyone had thought to ask, which nobody did. My father assumed I'd chosen Julian Vance because he was harmless, decorative, biddable, cheap enough to buy outright and grateful enough to behave once bought. He wasn't wrong. He simply credited the wrong instinct. I didn't want an easy 2 years. I wanted the most documented man I could find, because documented men don't surprise you, and I have exactly one relationship in my life that was never managed, measured, or priced in advance. It left me permanently disinclined to negotiate anything that mattered without a paper trail attached first. I have one blind spot. It has a name. It isn't Julian Vance's, and I did not intend to open a second one on his account. I met him once briefly before any of it was formal. My study, a Tuesday, a folder of terms he didn't ask to see a second time before signing. In person, he was exactly what 4 pages of documented recklessness had promised. Warm without cost, charming in the weightless way of a man who's never once needed his charm to hold up under real pressure, because nobody has ever pressed him hard enough to find out. I told him what the arrangement required: discretion, availability, a convincing performance at a small, finite number of events, for as long as my grandfather's clock needed a fiancé standing next to me in photographs. Compensation to match the inconvenience? He asked exactly one question: whether the compensation was retroactive to the paperwork or to the photographs. And I remember thinking, with the specific, weary satisfaction of a hypothesis testing itself twice in one meeting, that I'd found exactly what I came looking for. A man who wanted the money and nothing else, simple enough to manage, unambitious enough never to need managing twice. I signed the arrangement 2 days later. He moved an unreasonable number of expensive boxes into an apartment I paid for, and for 8 months he was, without exception, exactly the man the file had described. Pleasant at dinners, absent the rest of the time, entirely uninterested in me as anything beyond the reason his tailor had stopped calling to threaten him. I'm telling you all of this so that whatever happens next will make sense to someone, even if that someone is only me, rereading this months from now and wondering why I didn't see it sooner. I built my entire choice of him on the strength of a paper trail. The paper trail has stopped being true. I don't know when it stopped. I only know that a man with no documented history of producing a single unpaid-for thought made me coffee I didn't ask for, 4 mornings running, and noticed, without being told, that I take it 1 degree cooler than anyone has ever bothered to check. That the same man who once needed a folder of terms explained to him twice, stood in my own kitchen this week, heard exactly how much weight I've been carrying alone before I'd said a word about it, and told me, plainly, unprompted, uncompensated, that I'd spent 2 years bracing for a stranger and gotten handed one who refused to behave like it. In a register I have never once heard him use. He didn't come too close between us when he said it. That's the detail I keep returning to, against my better judgment. He left exactly enough room that I could have stepped back at any point, as though he'd already decided the space was mine to close if I wanted it closed, and I didn't. And I noticed myself not wanting to before I noticed anything else about that morning at all. I have also, against my better judgment, started looking forward to the argument itself. The specific rhythm of it, him absurd, me colder, him worse. Both of us performing composure at each other until one of us breaks first. And it is, infuriatingly, not always me anymore. Am I more curious? Maybe I should call it an anomaly, because I trust that word considerably more. And I intend to keep calling it that for as long as it still does any useful work. Elena closed the diary a little after midnight and didn't reopen it. She thought, it isn't the man 3 law firms and 1 very expensive investigator agreed on 8 months ago. I don't have a name yet for what it actually is. I just feel uneasy discovering that the one document in my life I trusted completely has quietly, without any warning at all, stopped telling the truth.